The scent of fresh baked apple pie and simmering beef stew filled every corner of Maple Grove Diner, a place where time seemed to move at the pace of honey dripping from a wooden spoon. Margaret James had worked these worn linoleum floors for 8 years, her hands steady as she poured coffee and her smile genuine as she asked about grandchildren and weekend plans. At 34, she had the kind of quiet grace that made strangers feel like old friends, and the sort of memory that could recall how every regular customer liked their eggs. The diner sat on the edge of Cedar Falls, a town where everyone knew everyone and secrets were as rare as snow in July. Margaret's great-grandmother had opened this place in 1952, serving truckers and traveling salesmen hearty meals that stuck to their ribs. Now, 3 generations later, Margaret carried on the tradition with the same cast-iron skillets and the same commitment to making every person who walked through that door feel like family. She was wiping down table 6 when the black sedan pulled up outside, its polished surface reflecting the afternoon sun like a dark mirror. Margaret glanced up from her work, noting how the car seemed out of place against the backdrop of pickup trucks and aging sedans that usually filled their parking lot. The vehicle was expensive, the kind that whispered wealth rather than shouting it. The man who emerged moved with the careful precision of someone accustomed to being watched. He was tall, perhaps 6'2", with salt and pepper hair that had been styled by someone who charged more for a haircut than Margaret made in a week. His suit was charcoal gray, tailored to perfection, and his shoes gleamed despite the dusty gravel of the parking lot. But it was his eyes that caught Margaret's attention as he approached the door. They were the color of winter storms, carrying a weight that spoke of sleepless nights and decisions that affected thousands of lives. James Van Dyke stepped into the diner and paused, his gaze sweeping across the checkered tablecloths and vintage photographs that adorned the walls. The bell above the door announced his arrival with a cheerful jingle that seemed almost musical in the quiet of the late afternoon lull. He had eaten in restaurants where a single meal cost more than most people's monthly salary, had attended dinners in palaces and penthouse suites that overlooked entire cities. Yet something about this simple place with its honest smells and unpretentious charm made him pause. Margaret approached with a menu tucked under her arm and a coffee pot in her hand. "Afternoon, sir? Just yourself today?" Her voice carried the warm cadence of someone who had spent her life making others feel welcome. But there was something in this man's presence that made her unusually aware of her faded uniform and the small coffee stain on her apron. "Yes, just me," James replied, his voice carrying the refined accent of expensive education and boardroom negotiations. He chose a booth near the window, sliding onto the red vinyl seat with an economy of movement that suggested he was accustomed to making quick decisions and sticking with them. As Margaret poured his coffee, she noticed his hands. They were soft, unmarked by the kind of manual labor that scarred the palms of most men in Cedar Falls, but there was a slight tremor in his fingers that spoke of stress and too much caffeine. His wedding ring caught the light as he reached for the sugar dispenser, a simple gold band that seemed oddly modest for someone who clearly moved in circles where wealth was measured in zeros. Most people couldn't count. "The beef stew is fresh today," Margaret offered, settling into the comfortable rhythm of describing the day's specials. "My great-grandmother's recipe. We slow cook it for 6 hours until the meat falls apart with a fork. Comes with fresh cornbread and honey butter." Something flickered across James's face at the mention of her great-grandmother, a shadow of memory that passed too quickly for Margaret to interpret. "That sounds perfect," he said, closing the menu without looking at it. "And perhaps you could tell me about this place. It has character." Margaret's smile brightened as she tucked a strand of auburn hair behind her ear. "Been in my family since 1952. Great-grandmother Rose opened it with nothing but a dream and her grandmother's recipes. She used to say that food was love made visible, and if you put love into every dish, people would taste it and keep coming back." James nodded slowly, his storm-colored eyes studying the black and white photographs that lined the walls. Images of the diner's early days, of Rose James in her flour-dusted apron serving coffee to men in overalls and women in modest dresses. The photographs told a story of simpler times, of a community built around shared meals and honest conversation. "Your great-grandmother sounds like a remarkable woman," James said, his voice carrying a note of something that might have been wistfulness. "Did she ever talk about her early customers? The people who helped build this place?" Margaret refilled his coffee cup, noting how his question seemed to carry more weight than casual conversation. "Oh, she had stories about everyone. Rose had a memory like a steel trap and a heart big enough for the whole county. She used to say that every person who sat in these booths left a little bit of their story behind, and she was just the keeper of all those stories." As Margaret returned to the kitchen to place his order, James remained motionless in his booth, his gaze fixed on a particular photograph near the corner of the room. It showed Rose James standing behind the counter in what appeared to be the late 1950s, her arm around a young man in a military uniform. The soldier's face was partially obscured by shadow, but something about his posture, the way he held his shoulders, sent an electric shock of recognition through James's carefully controlled composure. The beef stew arrived steaming hot, accompanied by a basket of cornbread that filled the air with the scent of butter and honey. Margaret set the plate down with practiced efficiency, but James barely acknowledged the meal. His attention remained fixed on that photograph, his coffee growing cold as minutes ticked by in silence. "Sir, is everything all right?" Margaret's voice carried a note of concern. In 8 years of serving customers, she had developed an instinct for reading people, and something about this man's sudden stillness set off alarm bells in her mind. James forced his attention back to her, managing a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I was just admiring the photographs, that one in particular." He nodded toward the corner. "The young soldier with your great-grandmother. Do you know who he was?" Margaret followed his gaze to the familiar image. "That's from 1958, I think. Great-grandmother never told us his name, but she used to say he was special. A young man far from home who needed a place to belong. She fed him for free for months when he was between jobs, said he reminded her of her own son who died in Korea." The fork in James's hand trembled slightly as he cut into the tender beef. "Did she ever mention what happened to him? Where he went? Rose always said he was destined for great things, that he had the kind of mind that could change the world if given the chance. She helped him with odd jobs around town, connected him with people who could give him work. The last she heard, he had moved east. Something about a scholarship or a job opportunity. She never saw him again, but she kept that photograph on the wall for 60 years. James set down his fork, the meal forgotten as Margaret's words washed over him. The young soldier in the photograph had been 18 years old, hungry and desperate, working construction jobs during the day and sleeping in a boarding house that smelled of mildew and broken dreams. Rose James had been the first person in Cedar Falls to treat him with genuine kindness, to see potential where others saw only another drifter passing through. "Margaret," James said, his voice carrying a gravity that made her pause in her wiping of the neighboring table. "Would it be possible to see that photograph more closely?" Something in his tone made her set down her cleaning supplies and walk to the corner where the image hung. She lifted it carefully from its nail, handling it with the reverence reserved for family treasures. As she brought it back to his table, James stood up, his height making the small diner seem even more intimate. The photograph was clearer up close, the details more pronounced. Rose James's kind face beamed with maternal pride as she stood beside the young soldier, her arm resting on his shoulder in a gesture of protective affection. But it was the soldier's face, no longer obscured by shadow, that made James's carefully constructed world begin to crumble around him. Margaret watched as color drained from his face, as his breathing became shallow and rapid. "Sir, are you feeling all right? Should I call someone?" James reached into his jacket with trembling fingers, withdrawing a worn leather wallet. From its depths, he produced a small photograph, creased and faded with age. It showed a young woman with gentle eyes and a warm smile, standing in what appeared to be the same diner, wearing the same flour-dusted apron that Rose James wore in the wall photograph. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the hum of the coffee machine. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to think very carefully before you answer." She nodded, sensing that whatever was about to happen would change both their lives forever. "This woman in my photograph," James continued, his hands shaking as he placed the image on the table beside the diner's picture. "Did your great-grandmother ever mention having a sister? Someone who left Cedar Falls many years ago?" Margaret stared at the two photographs side by side, her mind racing as she processed the impossible similarity between the two women. The same gentle eyes, the same warm smile, the same way of holding their shoulders as if they were ready to embrace the whole world. "She never mentioned a sister," Margaret said slowly, her voice catching as the implications began to dawn on her. "But there was always something she wouldn't talk about, a sadness in her eyes whenever anyone asked about family. She used to say that love sometimes meant letting go, even when it broke your heart." James's knees buckled, and he gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. The truth that had eluded him for 35 years was suddenly blazing before him like a beacon in the darkness. The young soldier in Rose's photograph wasn't just some random customer she had helped. He was looking at his own face, 65 years younger, captured in a moment of hope and possibility that he had almost forgotten existed. The silence in the diner stretched like a taut wire, broken only by the gentle bubble of coffee percolating and the distant hum of traffic on the county road. Margaret found herself holding her breath as she studied the two photographs, her mind struggling to process what her eyes were telling her. The resemblance between the women was undeniable, yet impossible to reconcile with everything she thought she knew about her family's history. James Van Dyke remained standing, his knuckles white as he gripped the table's edge. The carefully constructed walls he had built around his past were crumbling brick by brick, revealing memories he had buried so deep he had convinced himself they were dreams. The smell of Rose's apple pie, the sound of her laughter as she told stories to anyone who would listen, the way she had looked at him not as a burden but as a young man worth believing in. "Mr. Van Dyke?" Margaret's voice seemed to come from very far away. "That's your name, isn't it? I saw it on the credit card when you paid for gas at Miller's Station last month." He looked up sharply, surprised that she had recognized him. James Van Dyke, CEO of Van Dyke Industries, a man whose face graced the covers of financial magazines and whose decisions moved markets. In Cedar Falls, he was just another stranger passing through, or so he had thought. "You remember me from a month ago?" His voice carried a mixture of surprise and something that might have been gratitude. Margaret nodded, her training as a waitress having taught her to notice details others might miss. "You bought coffee and asked directions to the old cemetery on Maple Street. You seemed like you were looking for something specific, the cemetery." James closed his eyes, remembering that gray October morning when he had finally worked up the courage to visit Rose's grave. He had stood there for over an hour, reading the simple headstone that bore her name and dates, trying to find words for all the things he had never said. Rose Elizabeth James, beloved mother and grandmother, 1920 to 1998. The inscription had been worn smooth by weather and time, but the love behind it was still visible in every carefully chosen letter. "I was looking for someone I should have visited years ago," James said quietly. "Someone who changed my life in ways I'm only now beginning to understand." Margaret set the photographs down gently, her movements careful and deliberate, as if she were handling pieces of a puzzle that might shatter if disturbed. "Mr. Van Dyke, I think we need to have a longer conversation. Would you mind if I closed the diner early today? He nodded, watching as she moved through the familiar routine of securing the restaurant. She flipped the sign on the front door, turned off the neon lights that advertised fresh pie and daily specials, and poured 2 fresh cups of coffee before settling into the booth across from him. The late afternoon sun slanted through the windows, casting long shadows across the checkered tablecloths and creating an atmosphere of intimate confession. "Tell me about Rose," James said, his voice steady now despite the emotional earthquake that was reshaking his foundation. "Tell me about the woman who saved my life." Margaret wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, drawing comfort from its warmth as she searched for the right words. Great-grandmother Rose was the kind of person who could see straight into your soul. She had this way of knowing exactly what someone needed, whether it was a hot meal, a kind word, or just someone to listen without judgment. People used to drive from 3 counties over just to sit in her kitchen and pour out their troubles. She paused, her eyes growing distant as she accessed memories passed down through generations of family stories. But there was always something else about her, something she kept locked away. Mother used to say that Rose carried a secret sadness, like she was mourning someone who was still alive. Every year on the same date in September, she would close the diner and spend the day alone. No one ever knew why. James felt his chest tighten as pieces of the puzzle began falling into place. September 15th. The date was burned into his memory like a brand, the day he had left Cedar Falls with nothing but a bus ticket and a promise to write. A promise he had broken within 6 months as ambition and opportunity pulled him further and further away from the small-town values that had shaped him. "Did she ever talk about someone named Jimmy?" he asked, using the nickname Rose had given him during those long summer months when he had worked odd jobs and dreamed of a future that seemed impossibly far away. Margaret's eyes widened in recognition. Jimmy was her ghost story, the one person she talked about but never explained. She used to say that Jimmy had the brightest mind she'd ever encountered, that he could see solutions where other people only saw problems. But she also said he was the one who got away, the son she never had who broke her heart when he disappeared. The words hit James like a physical blow, each syllable carrying the weight of 35 years of regret. He had convinced himself that leaving was the right choice, that a poor kid from nowhere had no business maintaining connections to a life he was trying to escape. He had told himself that Rose would understand, that she would want him to pursue the opportunities that were opening up for him in the business world. "I never wrote," he whispered, the confession tearing at his throat like broken glass. "I promised her I would write, that I would visit, that I would never forget what she had done for me. And then life got complicated and months turned into years. And suddenly it felt like too much time had passed to reach out." Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand over his, a gesture that carried the same unconditional compassion he remembered from Rose's touch. "She never stopped believing in you. Even at the end, when the cancer was taking everything else away, she would talk about her Jimmy and wonder if he had found his way in the world." The mention of cancer sent another shock through James's system. He had been traveling in Asia when Rose passed away, closing deals and building the empire that would eventually make him one of the wealthiest men in America. He had learned of her death through a brief obituary in the Cedar Falls Gazette that someone had forwarded to his office. By the time he had seen it, the funeral was over, the flowers had wilted, and another opportunity to say goodbye had slipped through his fingers like sand. "I should have been here," he said, his voice cracking with emotion he had spent decades learning to suppress. "She was dying, and I was in Tokyo arguing about market projections and profit margins." "She wouldn't have wanted you to carry that guilt," Margaret replied firmly. "Rose always said that love wasn't about being in the same place at the same time. It was about carrying someone with you wherever you went, letting their influence shape the person you became." James looked up at her with eyes that were bright with unshed tears. But what kind of person did I become? I built a fortune by being ruthless, by cutting ties with anything that might slow me down or make me vulnerable. I turned myself into exactly the kind of man Rose would have been disappointed in. Did you? Margaret challenged gently. Or did you use the strength she gave you to survive in a world that doesn't value kindness? Maybe the question isn't what kind of person you became, but what kind of person you're choosing to be now. The diner fell silent again as James contemplated her words. Outside, the shadows were growing longer, and the first streetlights were beginning to flicker on along Main Street. Cedar Falls was settling into its evening rhythm, a pace of life that seemed as foreign to James as a different language. In his world, evenings were for networking events and strategic phone calls for reviewing reports and planning the next day's conquests. "I'm Margaret," he said finally. "There's something else I need to tell you. Something that might explain why I'm really here." She nodded, sensing that they were approaching the heart of whatever had brought this powerful man back to a place he had spent decades trying to forget. "3 months ago I had a heart attack," James continued, his voice steady but weighted with the gravity of mortality. "Nothing too serious, the doctors said, but serious enough to make me start asking questions about what my life had actually meant. I realized that I had spent 35 years building something impressive on paper, but I couldn't name a single person who would genuinely mourn my passing." He paused, gathering the courage to voice the fear that had been haunting him since that moment in the hospital, when he had awakened to find no visitors, no flowers, no evidence that his absence from the world would leave any meaningful void. "I started thinking about Rose, about the way she had believed in me when I couldn't believe in myself. I began to wonder if there was still time to become the man she thought I could be, or if I had traveled too far down the wrong path to find my way back." Margaret felt her heart breaking for this man who had achieved everything the world told him to want, only to discover that success without connection was just an elaborate form of failure. She thought about Rose's stories, about the young soldier who had possessed such potential, and she began to understand that this wasn't just a chance encounter. This was the universe providing an opportunity for redemption that most people never received. "There's something I haven't told you," Margaret said, rising from the booth and walking to the old cash register that had served the diner for decades. From beneath it, she withdrew a wooden box that had been worn smooth by countless hands. "Rose left instructions that this was only to be opened if someone came looking for Jimmy." James felt his breath catch as Margaret returned to the table with the box. It was simple pine, the kind of container that might hold recipes or important papers, but there was something about the way she handled it that suggested its contents were precious beyond measure. "She made me promise," Margaret continued, "that if a man ever came here asking about the soldier in the photograph, if he seemed to carry the weight of regret and the hope for redemption, I was to give him this box." With trembling fingers, James lifted the lid. Inside, nestled in tissue paper that had yellowed with age, was a collection of items that transported him instantly back to that pivotal summer of 1958. A letter in Rose's careful handwriting addressed simply to "My dear Jimmy." A small wooden cross that had hung above her kitchen window, and beneath it all a bank book showing regular deposits made in his name, month after month, year after year, until Rose's death in 1998. The letter was brief, written in the flowing script he remembered from the notes she used to leave with his lunch when he worked construction jobs around town. "Jimmy," it read, "I always knew you would find your way back when the time was right. The money isn't much, but it's what I could set aside each month from the tips and the extra pie sales. Consider it an investment in the man I always knew you would become. Use it to help others find their way, just as you once found yours. All my love, Rose." James lifted the bank book with hands that shook so violently he could barely read the numbers. 40 years of deposits, compounding interest, and careful management had turned Rose's modest contributions into a sum that would have been significant even to a man of his wealth. But it wasn't the money that brought him to his knees on the worn linoleum floor of Maple Grove Diner. It was the realization that Rose had never stopped believing in him, never stopped preparing for his return, never stopped loving the young man he had been even as he transformed into someone she might not have recognized. Margaret knelt beside him as he wept, her hand resting gently on his shoulder in a gesture that connected him across the decades to the woman who had seen his potential when he couldn't see it himself. The diner around them held its breath, as if even the building understood that something sacred was taking place within its walls. When James finally found the strength to stand, his legs remained unsteady beneath him. The weight of 40 years of accumulated guilt and regret seemed to press down on his shoulders like a physical burden. Margaret remained close, her presence a steady anchor in the emotional storm that threatened to overwhelm him completely. "She never gave up on me," he whispered, clutching the bank book against his chest. "Even when I gave up on myself, even when I convinced myself that the past didn't matter, she was still there, still believing." Margaret helped him back into the booth, noting how this titan of industry had been reduced to something raw and human by the simple power of unconditional love. She had seen grief before in these same seats, had witnessed countless customers work through loss and disappointment over cups of coffee that grew cold while they processed their pain. But there was something different about James's anguish, something that spoke to decades of carefully buried emotion finally finding its way to the surface. "Tell me about that summer," she said gently, settling back into her seat across from him. "Help me understand what Rose meant to you." James stared down at his hands, seeing not the manicured fingers of a corporate executive but the calloused palms of an 18-year-old who had worked dawn to dusk just to afford a room and 3 meals a day. The memories came flooding back with startling clarity, as if they had been waiting just beneath the surface for someone to give them permission to emerge. "I was nobody," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "My father had died in a factory accident when I was 16, and my mother couldn't afford to keep me at home. I'd been drifting from town to town for 2 years, taking whatever work I could find, sleeping wherever someone would let me. When I got off the bus in Cedar Falls, I had exactly $17 to my name and holes in both my shoes." He paused, lost in the recollection of that first day when he had walked into this very diner, drawn by the smell of fresh bread and the warmth that seemed to radiate through the windows. Rose had taken one look at him and somehow seen past the dirt and desperation to whatever potential lay buried beneath. "She hired me to fix the back steps," James continued, a faint smile touching his lips at the memory. "Paid me $5 and threw in a hot meal. But when I finished the job, she found another one, and then another. It was like she had an endless list of projects that needed doing, all of them just important enough to justify keeping me around." Margaret nodded, recognizing the pattern. Rose had been famous throughout Cedar Falls for her ability to find work for anyone who needed it, to create opportunities where none had existed before. She had possessed an intuitive understanding of human dignity, knowing that people needed to earn their help rather than simply receive it as charity. "The construction crew I worked with thought I was crazy for spending my evenings here instead of at Murphy's Tavern with the other guys," James said. "But Rose's kitchen felt like home in a way I hadn't experienced since my father died. She would quiz me about books while I helped her prep vegetables, challenge me to solve problems while we worked on the daily specials." He looked up at Margaret, his eyes bright with the intensity of recovered memory. "She saw something in me that I couldn't see in myself. When I told her I'd never finished high school, she brought me textbooks from the library. When I mentioned being interested in business, she started showing me how she managed the diner's books. She treated my mind like it was something precious, worth developing and protecting." The afternoon light was fading outside, casting the diner in golden tones that made the vintage photographs seem to glow with their own inner light. Margaret found herself transported by James's words, seeing her great-grandmother through the eyes of someone whose life had been fundamentally altered by her kindness. "What happened when you left?" Margaret asked, though she suspected the answer would be painful for both of them. James's expression darkened, the guilt that had been his constant companion for decades settling back over his features like a familiar mask. A man came through town in late August, a businessman from Chicago who was looking for bright young people to join his company. Rose had been talking to everyone about me, about how smart I was, how hard I worked. When he offered me a position, she practically pushed me toward the opportunity. He reached for his coffee cup but found his hands were still shaking too badly to lift it steadily. She was so proud, so excited about what this could mean for my future. She spent her own money to buy me a decent suit for the interview, made me promise to write her every week and tell her about all the important things I was learning. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of promises broken and opportunities squandered. Margaret could see the young man James had been, full of hope and determination, standing on the threshold of a new life with Rose's blessing ringing in his ears. She could also see the successful businessman he had become, hardened by years of competition and compromise, gradually losing touch with the values that had once defined him. "The letters stopped after 6 months," James continued, his voice thick with self-recrimination. "At first, I told myself I was too busy, that I would write a long letter soon and catch up on everything. Then it became embarrassing how long I'd waited. Then it became easier to pretend that part of my life had never happened." Margaret felt a flash of anger on her great-grandmother's behalf, imagining Rose checking the mail day after day, waiting for news that never came. But as she looked at James's tortured expression, she realized that he had punished himself more severely than she ever could. "She never stopped asking about you," Margaret said softly. Even 20 years later, whenever someone mentioned meeting a young businessman from Chicago, her eyes would light up and she'd ask if they knew anything about her Jimmy. The words hit James like physical blows, each one driving home the magnitude of the love he had thoughtlessly discarded. He had spent decades building walls around his emotions, convincing himself that sentiment was weakness and that successful people couldn't afford to look backward. Now those walls were crumbling, revealing the frightened young man who had always lived at the core of his success. "I kept telling myself I would come back someday," he whispered, "when I was established enough, wealthy enough, successful enough to make her proud. I wanted to walk through that door as someone important, someone worthy of the faith she'd shown in me." Margaret leaned forward, her voice carrying the same gentle firmness she remembered from Rose's approach to difficult conversations. "James, she was already proud of you. From the moment you walked through that door, she was proud. The success you achieved afterward was just confirmation of what she already knew. But I became everything she would have hated," James protested, the words tumbling out in a rush of confession. "I crushed smaller companies, fired thousands of people, made decisions based purely on profit margins. I turned into exactly the kind of person she used to warn me about, the kind who forgot where they came from and what really mattered." Margaret studied his face, seeing not the ruthless corporate raider he described, but a man who had lost his way and was desperately seeking a path back to his authentic self. She thought about Rose's philosophy, about the way her great-grandmother had always believed that people were fundamentally good, that circumstances and choices could lead them astray, but that redemption was always possible for those who genuinely sought it. "Did you ever stop to think," Margaret said carefully, "that maybe Rose's influence was still there even when you couldn't see it? That maybe some part of her teachings was guiding your decisions even in that different world?" James looked at her with confusion, unable to see how his corporate career could be connected to the woman who had fed stray cats and never turned away anyone in need. Margaret stood and walked to a filing cabinet behind the counter, returning with a folder thick with newspaper clippings and magazine articles. After you left, Rose started following your career. She subscribed to business magazines, had the librarian help her use the internet to research your company. She kept every article that mentioned your name. She spread the clippings across the table, revealing decades of coverage about Van Dyke Industries. But these weren't just random business stories. They were carefully selected pieces that highlighted the company's charitable giving, its employee benefits programs, its environmental initiatives. Rose had been collecting evidence of the man James was becoming, looking for signs that the values she had instilled in him were still alive beneath the corporate exterior. "Look at this one," Margaret said, pointing to an article from 1995. Van Dyke Industries creates scholarship fund for underprivileged youth, $500,000 annually to help kids who can't afford college. She moved to another clipping. Company provides emergency housing for employees affected by flood. CEO personally oversees relief efforts. James stared at the articles with growing amazement. These were initiatives he had approved almost automatically, decisions that had felt like common sense rather than conscious acts of charity. He had never connected them to the lessons Rose had taught him about taking care of people, about using whatever advantages you had to lift up those who needed help. She saw it, Margaret continued, her voice warm with pride. Even when you couldn't see it yourself, she saw that her Jimmy was still there, still making choices based on the values she'd taught him. She used to say that success didn't corrupt good people, it just gave them bigger opportunities to do good. The revelation was staggering. While James had been torturing himself with guilt over abandoning his principles, Rose had been documenting evidence that those principles had never truly left him. She had been watching from afar as he built something that was more than just profitable, something that reflected the lessons about responsibility and compassion she had taught him in her kitchen. "The Employee Medical Fund," James said suddenly, his voice filled with wonder. "I started it after my first big acquisition when I realized that some of the workers we'd inherited had been going without health care. I told myself it was just good business, keeping people healthy and productive." "And the literacy program?" Margaret prompted, pointing to another clipping. "We partnered with libraries in low-income neighborhoods, provided computers and internet access. I said it was about developing future talent pools, but..." He trailed off, remembering Rose's insistence that education was the key to everything, that knowledge was the one thing no one could ever take away from you. Margaret watched as understanding dawned in his eyes as he began to see his career not as a betrayal of Rose's teachings, but as an extension of them. The scared young man she had nurtured had grown into someone who wielded enormous influence, and whether he had realized it or not, he had used that influence in ways that would have made her proud. "She knew," Margaret said softly. "Rose always said that people revealed their true character not in small moments of kindness, but in how they used power when they thought no one was watching." These articles weren't just business decisions to her. They were proof that the boy she'd believed in had grown into a man worthy of that belief. James felt something shift inside him, a loosening of the knot of guilt and regret that had been choking him for decades. For the first time, he began to consider the possibility that his success hadn't been a betrayal of his origins, but a fulfillment of them. Rose hadn't just fed him and housed him during that crucial summer. She had planted seeds that had grown into a forest he hadn't even realized he was cultivating. The diner had grown dark around them as evening settled over Cedar Falls. Margaret reached over to flip on the overhead lights, but the warm glow only emphasized the intimacy of their conversation. Outside, the town was settling into its nighttime rhythm. But inside Maple Grove Diner, two people were discovering that the threads connecting past and present were stronger than either had imagined. "There's one more thing," Margaret said, returning to the wooden box that had started this journey of revelation. From its depths, she withdrew a small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age. Rose kept this during the months you were here. She wrote in it every night, documenting your progress, your conversations, your dreams for the future. James accepted the journal with trembling hands, afraid of what he might find within its pages. The leather was soft with age, worn smooth by Rose's fingers as she had held it night after night, recording her observations about the young man who had wandered into her life. The entries were dated, starting with his arrival in Cedar Falls and continuing through his departure. Rose's handwriting was careful and deliberate, her words chosen with the precision of someone who understood that she was documenting something important. June 15, 1958. A young man came in today, hungry and proud. Reminds me of my brother at that age, all potential and stubbornness. Gave him work fixing the steps. Something tells me this one's going to surprise us all. James felt his throat constrict as he read his younger self through Rose's eyes. She had seen past his defenses from the very beginning, had recognized the intelligence and drive that he had been too beaten down to acknowledge in himself. July 3, 1958. Jimmy finished the inventory system I asked him to design. It's brilliant, more sophisticated than anything we've ever used. He has a mind for business that could take him anywhere. I pray he finds people who will nurture that gift instead of exploiting it. The entries continued, documenting his growth and development through that transformative summer. Rose had been more than just a kind benefactor. She had been a careful observer, noting his strengths and weaknesses, celebrating his victories and supporting him through his doubts. August 20th, 1958. The man from Chicago was here today. He offered Jimmy a position that could change his life. I'm terrified and thrilled in equal measure. Terrified because I know I'll lose him. Thrilled because I know this is his chance to become everything he's meant to be. I made him promise to write, but I know he won't. Young men like Jimmy are meant to fly, not look back. James's vision blurred as he read Rose's prediction of his own behavior. She had known even then that he would disappear from her life, but she had encouraged him to take the opportunity anyway. Her love had been selfless enough to let him go, even knowing it would break her heart. The final entry was dated the day before his departure, August 30th, 1958. Jimmy leaves tomorrow. I've given him everything I can, but I pray it will be enough to sustain him in the world he's entering. He carries a light inside him, a goodness that I hope will survive whatever challenges await. If he never comes back, if he never writes, I will still consider these months the greatest privilege of my life. To have played a small part in launching such a remarkable young man into the world is gift enough for any lifetime. James closed the journal and sat in silence, overwhelmed by the depth of Rose's love and the magnitude of his own blindness. She had seen him more clearly than he had ever seen himself, had loved him more completely than he had ever deserved. And she had released him to pursue his destiny with a grace that he was only now beginning to comprehend. Margaret reached across the table and took his hand, her touch warm and steady in the gathering darkness. James, she never expected you to come back. She never expected letters or visits or acknowledgement. All she wanted was for you to become the man she knew you could be. And you did. The truth of her words settled over him like a benediction, lifting the weight of guilt he had carried for so many years. Rose hadn't been waiting for him to return and validate her investment. She had been watching from afar as he validated it through his actions, through the choices he made when he thought no one who mattered was paying attention. I need to do something, James said suddenly, his voice stronger than it had been all evening. I need to make this right, not just for me but for her memory. Margaret nodded, sensing that they had reached the moment when understanding would transform into action. What do you have in mind? James looked around the diner, seeing it with new eyes. This wasn't just a restaurant. It was a monument to the woman who had changed his life, a place where her values and her spirit continued to nourish anyone who walked through the door. But it was also a business struggling to survive in a world that increasingly favored efficiency over authenticity. This place, he said, his voice growing stronger with each word. Maple Grove Diner represents everything Rose believed in. It's a place where people are fed, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. It's exactly the kind of institution that gets lost when communities change, when progress forgets to honor the foundations it's built on. Margaret felt her pulse quicken as she began to understand where his thoughts were leading. "James, what are you saying?" He stood up, pacing the small space between the booths as his mind began working with the focused intensity that had built his empire. "I'm saying that Rose's legacy shouldn't be confined to memory. It should be living, breathing, growing. This diner should be the first of many, a chain of restaurants that proves you can be successful without sacrificing your soul. Sometimes the most powerful moments in life happen when we least expect them. A simple photograph, a shared memory, and suddenly, everything changes." James Van Dyke walked into that diner as a successful but empty man, haunted by choices he thought had defined him. He left as someone who finally understood that success without heart is just an expensive form of failure. Margaret James showed him that some connections transcend time, that love planted with faith can bloom decades later in ways we never imagine. Their story reminds us that it's never too late to honor the people who believed in us when we couldn't believe in ourselves.